If we realize that almost 99% of the time we engage in something that we think is going to kill us, it's just uncomfortable, the entire existence that we have in terms of a person changes because we're not effectively running from a bear that doesn't exist.
I'm Katie.
I'm Anna.
She's a psychotherapist.
And she runs a photography empire. Together we make music and we podcast
to encourage ourselves
and you
to do the things that scare us most.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Doing Scary Things podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 50th episode. Anna and I could not be more excited to celebrate it with all of you and with our special guest today, Dr. Jerome Lubbe, who is the only board-certified functional neurologist in Atlanta. Dr. Jerome is sharing tons of wisdom with us today, everything from how our brains deal with fear to his new Brain-Based Enneagram Model. Yes, it is mind-blowing. We know you're going to love this episode, and we can't wait to hear what you think. Here's Dr. Jerome.
So I always feel like when I answer my day job, it feels like in the afternoon I'm like moonlighting as a superhero or something, which is not the case. But during the daytime, I am what's called a functional neurologist. I'm the only board-certified functional neurologist inside the perimeter of Atlanta. There's 13 in the state of Georgia, 15 maybe now. Basically, what that means is I'm like a personal trainer for the brain. I teach people how to use their brain. Most people don't know how to actually use their brain, or that their brain can be used. Like any workout in the gym is consisting of a ton of different muscles, and depending on the muscle that you want to exercise, you do a different exercise, and you can strengthen and build that up, and seeing that and going, okay, if somebody comes into my office who is a 5-year-old who was run over by a dump truck, or a 70-year-old that's in a wheelchair and wants to walk again, or a 49-year-old that has bipolar secondary to a head injury from a plane crash, all things that happened last year. What does it look like to have somebody who's gone through all of the traditional routes of healthcare, and they either have plateaued, hit maximum clinical benefit, don't have a clear diagnosis, have a clear diagnosis, but don't have any kind of effective strategy for recovery. Long story short is I specialize in complex unresolved cases. So the people who come into me are dealing with complicated things. They are generally professional patients, which means that they have been in and out of doctors' offices a lot. And they generally know more than the providers that they're seeing. And a lot of them will even come in with a PowerPoint and a binder that is tabbed and organized. So
somewhere between House and Sherlock.
That's pretty much it. My executive assistant, Janet, will be very happy. She tends to call me Sherlock. The reality is I've been a patient for 20 years. My undergrad is digital animation and film. I used to do music full-time with my brothers. That's how I know Katie and her husband, Dan. The amazing thing is I ended up in a situation where I went to 21 specialists over 9 years to get a diagnosis of a complex brain issue called the Chiari malformation. It's basically a brain hernia. Long story short, I have a plumbing issue, and I actually have compression on all 4 sides of my brainstem, that regardless of what position I'm in, I pressure wash my brain with the fluid that's going into my brain. And I experience what it's like to be a patient every day I wake up before I even go in to be a provider. So I ended up becoming a doctor because I saw that there was a gap between the profound academic expertise of the traditional community and a lack of rehab protocols that were customized or I think holistic. And then the alternative community that was very holistic and very rehab based, but not very educated on the complex or the difficult cases in terms of how complex some patients can be. So I said, I'm going to kind of sit in between and bridge those 2 spaces and see if I can field both, because my experience was getting referred and pinballed back and forth between those 2, but nobody catching me in the middle. So I tend to be that catch in the middle, helping folks find some degree of recovery, because I think looking at it more like a personal trainer than a clinician, every single person on the planet can have some degree of improvement. They may not have a full recovery, but I don't think there's anybody on the planet that you can't find some degree of exercise that will improve their quality of life. So That's some of the spaces I'm in. And then outside of that, which is my primary space and my primary effort in life, is I've been married for 15 years to the only person I've ever dated. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 27-year-old because Deborah and I were surrogate parents for her younger brother from 12 to 19. He's now 27. I would not encourage testing the fortitude of your new marriage as a 19 and a 21-year-old by taking full guardianship of a 12-year-old that is emotionally distraught following the death of a parent. But hey, go for it. If it's up for you, it can be done with a lot of counseling and a lot of therapy. So parent, husband, kids also. And then outside of that, I also created the first brain-based model of the Enneagram that explains the Enneagram through brain science and practical application. And that is a lot of the different spaces I move in. My entire world is based on combining neuroscience with self-care and practical application, and the practical applications will vary.
You became a doctor because you were a patient. What's that journey been like, and what is it like now? Have you improved because of that?
Last year was the most effective year in my adult life at self-care. Literally everything that you could possibly do. Out-of-state trips to specialists in New York, sabbatical for an entire month, 1 week off every 2 months. I mean, everything that I could do to actively strategize, decreasing inflammation, increasing rest, giving my body a chance to recover, and having probably the worst year following a good year that I've had ever. And reconciling that and going, okay, do I look at this entire thing like I've failed miserably as a result of what last year looked like? Or do I reflect on it and see where we are in terms of the overall process? Because one of the things I preach pretty hard in the self-care process, because self-care is very different than self-help. Self-help lasts until about this time during the year. It's probably already done. It's probably already done last week. But self-care is a process of taking care of myself for a lifetime. And one of the mantras or the things that's repeated really regularly is you're looking for 3 to 5% incremental growth year over year. 3 to 5% incremental growth with compound interest makes a very different life in 10 years, a very different life in 20 years. Keeps me on the planet in another 10 years. And I feel like that was there. But the short answer is I've had to sit in this month and do my best to do an audit on last year and not an autopsy. Because a lot of what I felt last year was that there was a lot of hopefulness that died last year, and I'm trying to be in a space where I am leaning into the things that I know that are effective strategy, and revisiting, like I have done for many years, healthy strategies as a patient and a provider.
Well, I wanted to ask you about hopefulness, and this may be too big of a question, but if there's people out there who are in that hopelessness space, do you have any advice for them?
There are no bumper sticker answers, and a trivial answer only makes things worse. So that being said, let me give you just a straightforward technical answer about what I think hope is, and then what a practical, realistic action step is. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, which is about as classic a verse on depression as you could possibly ask for, because depression is not a bad thing. It's an indication that you've exceeded your threshold. Sadness is a natural response as a human being. It's actually appropriate. If someone dies, you should process sadness. If you don't, it's not healthy. There's a different diagnosis for that. The reality is hope lives in the part of the brain that deals with present tense experiences. It's in the right brain. It's a complex emotion. So hope being tied to the present is tied to the idea that nothing about your present experience can change. It's the idea of this quicksand, concrete, undeniable sense of drowning, and there is no way to get up for air. That the consistency and the weight and the gravity of what's happening is so present, so real, and so unchangeable. I think that's the nature of losing hope is you're not necessarily losing the metaphorical space of hope. You're losing the ability to connect with the present being different than what it is at the moment, especially if it's profoundly painful.
Like will it always be like this?
Yeah, and the different stages of grief that are processed, or depression or suicidality that are processed depending on which theories you read. But am I a burden? I'm always a burden to other people. I can't connect with this idea of what's happening because I'm so detached, because if I connect with it, the pain is too much, so I'll just disconnect and then the depression still builds. or the idea of being so heavily connected with your own emotional real estate that you can't perceive an environment that's different than the sheer weight of it, right? All of these different spaces, which are actually very connected to 2, 3, and 4 in the Enneagram for what it's worth. Those 3 things I just explained. First off, I think acknowledging it and recognizing it. One of the things that's really interesting if you study from an analogous standpoint what happens when somebody's drowning, one of the things that they explain if you're in a drowning incident is to actually stop moving, or if you're in quicksand, to stop moving. The reality of increasing your self-awareness about the severity of the situation from just purely a conceptual standpoint, like I am in this space, I'm in this place. I think acknowledging it and admitting it and being transparent about it is the same thing as going, I'm drowning, like I'm actually underwater. I'm in quicksand. I am not actively out of this situation. The recognition of the severity of the situation in and of itself, from a neurological perspective, amazingly enough, if you actually admit the truth of the situation, you start to switch in different gears in your brain that allow you to mentally and emotionally process a situation with more resources. Not that you're fixing it, that you're acknowledging that it exists, right? So I would say first and foremost, if it hasn't been admitted to yourself and it hasn't been admitted to someone else in a healthy, safe, impartial kind of feedback loop or a sounding board like a therapist, I think one of the first things to do is just being willing to say, I'm not very hopeful. I don't have any hope. And knowing that that's not a condemnation, that's an admission, which is different. And then the practical step, because there are so many ways that you could go in so many different places, but it is amazing how many parts of the brain turn on if you actively choose to take a single deep breath. That's it. Because if I choose to take a single deep breath, the part of my brain that recognizes that it's valid tells me there's something worth doing. The part of my brain that's dealing with a survival response has to take the backseat to the part of the brain that goes, everything is falling apart, but I'm actively choosing to engage with my breath. And then taking that deep breath brings more oxygen into your brain and might give you the opportunity to connect with the part of the brain that goes, what exactly is this emotion that I'm experiencing, and conceptually what might it be tied to, and what's the relationship with my hope or my lack of hope. You're not thinking through all of those things. You're not feeling through all of those things. But as soon as you just simply take a deep breath and have zero other agenda, it starts a cascade of everything in your brain going, okay, what do I do in the next 6 seconds? What do I do in the next 6 seconds? So the short answer is, I think admission, even to yourself, and then a single deep breath. I would not add anything else to that space until you have switched on more parts of your brain that start connecting dots as to something bigger that you can do next. Taking a bigger step might make you feel like you're going to step off a bridge or into a hole. But inching forward one breath at a time, I think is a survival strategy. Because to be honest, at that point, when you've lost that kind of hope, you're not looking at thriving and you're not looking at developing some new strategy. You're just trying to survive.
I love that. I think that's so helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So this is the Doing Scary Things podcast. We talk a fair amount about fear and the way that kind of manifests in different people's lives. Could you go ahead and tell us a little bit about how the brain deals with fear?
For sure. Wow. Let's see. Okay. How long do you want this answer to be?
Whatever you got.
Is this like a TED Talk answer? I'm kidding. It'll be short.
Yes, please.
The short answer is 100% of what the brain does as an instinctive initial response is to ask the question, am I going to survive? 100% of the time. How quickly it moves from that question to other questions is dependent on the severity or the reality or the perception of the fear involved. Because it's important to understand your brain cannot tell the difference between perception and reality. It also cannot tell the difference in time. Every issue is a present tense issue. Past tense and future tense are perceived, but everything around the world is processed in present tense as far as the brain is concerned, which is why 9/11 is such a powerful memory for people. Or a ratatouille experience, which I joke around is an example of you can have a powerful positive limbic attachment, meaning you know what it feels like to be loved. 60 years can go by, you can have a bite of food, and literally every system in your brain turns on and goes, that's what it feels like to be loved. It doesn't have a concept of time. It doesn't remember it. It re-experiences it until you remind it it's historical, okay? So if you have a survival response, then you have a question of saying, okay, if I'm not trying to survive, am I safe? If I'm safe, am I going to have a gratifying experience? Meaning, am I going to decrease pain or am I going to increase pleasure? So you go from survival to safety to self-gratification. And all of that happens subconsciously. So a metaphor that I use that will be easier for your listeners who aren't looking at a picture of what I just described or seeing my hands move, is to imagine what would happen if you were running away from an active, life-threatening situation, like a bear chasing you, right? Or somebody chasing you at gunpoint. If you're actively running away from a life-threatening situation, you're not asking the question, am I safe? You're asking the question, am I going to survive? If you're no longer being chased, but the event was recent, you're hiding around a corner, 10 minutes have gone by and there's no longer the active threat. Now you're asking the question, to what degree am I safe? Am I safe? I'm no longer trying to survive. I'm not running from the bear. The bear's not on my heels, but am I safe? Now it's been 3 years since you've seen a bear. You don't even remember what that bear looks like because it was so fearful you repressed it. Different kind of fear.
Sidebar.
Because there's all kinds of grades, right? But now you're in a situation where you're like, what about my life can I make more enjoyable and more life-giving? And what about my life can I eliminate or decrease or remove that makes my life unsafe? So self-gratification is a continuum of saying, if I decrease pain, it's more enjoyable. If I increase pleasure, it's more enjoyable. So self-gratification has a spectrum of both things. 2017, 117 migraines. 2018, 25 migraines. Somebody who's only had 10 migraines or 2 migraines in their life or 10 migraines in a year, here's a 25 migraine year and goes, that's a terrible year. But then when they realize, in contrast to the year before, it was nearly 100 migraines less, I haven't had a more pleasurable year. I've had a less painful year, so by default, that was more gratifying. So it feels more life-giving, right? Because it wasn't life-threatening to the same degree, so it's a spectrum. So the reason I say that is when you're talking about fear, one of the statements that I use pretty regularly that's really, really, I think, helpful for all of us, regardless of our professional background or our relationships, is when fear goes up, cognition goes down, and it goes down relative to the amount of fear or stress you're under. And sometimes people go, well, I don't feel like I'm a fearful person or I'm a stressful person. Don't worry about it. You can use synonymously, you can use fear, stress, or inputs, right? So if your brain is processing more information, like you're a heavy-duty driver and you work really, really hard, but you don't rest, your body is under a certain degree of stress. That stress is being processed subconsciously by the people that don't understand you have a goal that you're trying to meet or a deadline that you're trying to meet, and they perceive it as stress. The more consistent your stress, not only does your body break down, but your cognition, which is your ability to think and feel in complex ways, is going to be hampered. If anybody wants to see an example of this, watch Anchorman.
This is your official homework, listeners.
Right? They're sitting in the office and they're like, wow, that got out of hand kind of quick. You killed a man with a trident. You should probably low for a while, right? And all of us, if we've been, and I don't know if you're married. I know Katie is.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anybody who's been in a relationship with another human being for like 7 or 8 days, okay?
At least.
May have had a conversation when things went a little sideways. Things got a little heated. You killed a man with a trident, okay? That's the nature of a human experience that I refer to as hulking out. Because you realize Bruce Banner and the Hulk are the same person. They're the same person. They're just different in context. So Bruce Banner is your cognition. It's your frontal lobe. It's your capacity to think rationally and to feel intuitively, to have IQ and EQ, emotional intelligence and mental and intellectual intelligence. But the cognitive, capable, clear-headed, reasoning person of Bruce Banner goes out the window if there's a survival-based situation where the Hulk needs to show up. That's really, really normal and very appropriate. The problem is, what happens if you're running late for a flight and your body can't tell the difference between you missing that flight and you running from a bear, and you start to panic and your ability to think clearly and understand what you're feeling goes out the window, and you get into a knockdown, drag-out fight with your spouse, a friend, or one of your kids in the middle of the airport, and then you're trying to recover from it for a week or a year, depending on the length of the discomfort or trauma. So when you ask about fear, I think one of the things that I really highlight for folks is 95 to 97% of what happens to us happens subconsciously. It's an efficiency-based system, meaning if you walked into a corporate headquarters like Apple and you saw how many executive team members are actually on the manufacturing floor turning the screws, you'd never see it. They might go in and do a survey, but there's a reason that the executive team is not doing the in and out, day in and day out process of turning a screw or building something. They don't do the manufacturing process because it would be inefficient. So we have 95 to 97% of our system managing the actual processes themselves because that's what's efficient and keeps us alive. It's the basics of employees. The beautiful thing is that the 3 to 5% that hits conscious level has more authority. So if you take a CEO, a healthy CEO especially, even an unhealthy one, but a healthy one, or a leader or a parent, anybody that's in a position of authority, they make a single decision, it can impact the entire scope of the company. Steve Jobs made the iPhone and it changed the world, right? So you're looking at leadership being able to impact everything downstream in a much more efficient and a much more accelerated way. But managing up takes a lot more work. So if we're dealing with fear, a lot of the times I think a basic way of looking at it is, one, is it perspective or reality? Is there actually a bear trying to eat me? Or does it just feel like this because I'm trying to meet a deadline? Is it just a conversation that feels intimidating, or a phone number that came up on my caller ID for somebody I've had negative history with? The person's on the other side of the planet, but I feel like I'm literally in a life-threatening situation, and all it is a name and a number on a phone, on a screen. If we start to understand that in all of those spaces we have a system that's trying to keep us alive, and extending gratitude to that system for doing its job, but also know we have the resources of an executive team and a leadership that, if coached properly and developed properly, can step in and really, really help us. Then we start to understand that Bruce Banner and the Hulk are the same person, and sometimes the Hulk is designed to keep us and the planet alive, and sometimes he is not needed. And you gotta go, the sun is setting. The sun is setting. Right? If you guys haven't watched the Avengers, the last Avengers, where the Hulk actually integrates with Bruce Banner, I think is one of the best metaphors for healthy neuropsychology I've ever seen. And I don't know how many people have missed it, but it is brilliant.
Well, considering most people don't know how to use their brains, probably a lot of people missed it.
I certainly hope that I didn't say that critically when I said it.
Oh, no, I wholeheartedly agreed with that statement when you said it.
Most people don't know how to use their iPhone.
Which is way simpler.
Like, you teach people something about a smartphone. It's always fascinating for me when people are like, well, I don't understand why that person did that. I don't understand what they were thinking.
They weren't thinking.
And I go, Are you aware of what you're thinking most of the day? Like, do you understand why you don't understand what they don't understand? Like, do you understand your interior landscape about their understanding? Or like, I'm pretty sure, after having been married for 15 years, I'm starting to understand the interaction and the navigation of being in a healthy relationship with my spouse. But that's primarily because I've started, really more than anything, discovering over the last few years how my brain works. So it's probably helpful when we're talking about fear to realize that I can sometimes think my spouse or my kids are a bear. And if they're not, and I know that, and I have effective strategies around recognizing that that's not true, it just feels true, it might reframe my relationship with fear. Because I think a lot of times, I don't know if this is for you guys, but this is my own personal history. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. But I was raised in a faith-based culture that told me fear was wholly inappropriate and wholly inaccurate. And discovering that fear is not only the way that I was made, but was a resource that was given to me to keep me alive. And learning that I can have a healthy relationship with fear, because fear is the same thing that produces caution, and caution is the same thing as wisdom and discernment and wisdom are based off of caution, which is predicated on fear. Then I start to go, oh wow, this is a resource, not my eternal damnation. So I think reframing fear is something that's available, but in moderation.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think a huge part of our message is reframing fear, like you're saying. Like, if you feel fear, it doesn't mean you have to stop. We talk to a lot of people who are wanting to start or wanting to pursue things that feel scary to them. And that's just something we're trying to normalize, as you probably are going to feel that emotion.
Yeah.
It's not a reason to give in to that resistance.
I love that phrasing of fear is a resource. A lot of this conversation also is reminding me of how like, especially talking about context and relativity, sometimes what keeps people kind of small in their thinking or what they're willing to pursue is they feel foolish, I guess, if something seemingly small is very intimidating to them, or taking that first step is really scary. But, compared to doing something else that looks bigger, it doesn't seem as valid. Like, they shouldn't be afraid of it, but they are. So they just stay where they are. And I think there's really something to be said about that.
Yeah.
Anything can look like a bear. It could be a sticky note on your desk that looks like a bear, or it could be, an active shooter.
Yeah.
It could be anything, and if it feels like a bear to you, that's useful information. It's not that we should discount the sticky note because active shooters exist.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest opportunities for compassion and for grace. None of us, even in our own interior space, have the comprehensive knowledge or understanding or expertise or authority to disqualify the relevancy of someone's fear.
That's a great perspective. Just being cautious of time here, can we go ahead and switch gears? Because I heard the other part of your work is Enneagram based. And so that's fascinating. Can you tell us how that kind of came about?
Yeah, the funny thing is I was in the middle of doing my doctorate and doing some post-grad work, and a buddy of mine reached out and he's like, bro, I don't know what it is, but I feel like this is something that you need to connect with. And I told him, man, I don't say this to sound like I'm glorifying busy, but I don't have the time. I'm doing 115 credits in a calendar year, commuting 10 hours a week and dealing with migraines. I'm not practicing good self-care, and I don't really have the time to study this thing called the Enneagram or whatever it was, And every time I voice to texted Enneagram, A-N-Y-A-gram, Enneagram, you have a car and you have a car.
Siri doesn't know.
Enneagram at all. Yeah, exactly.
And I joke around that he was relentless because there's a lot of people that we know around the Enneagram that are relentless. But man, we've done so much life together and we have so much relational equity that he was persistent in a healthy way. He was like, I'm telling you, I can't explain it, man. It's for him, it just felt like he was led to consistently bring this back up for me. And so he got me an audiobook by Richard Rohr. I listened to it on a commute. It was a 9.5-hour audio tape. Which was so surreal last month that Suzanne Stabile posted a photo of Richard Rohr holding my book, which was they're having lunch together and she gave him my copy, and I'm like, 10 years ago the first introduction was him on a recording, so it's just that helped me to be hopeful.
Yeah,
such a nice and profound experience. I listened to this recording and I'm like, hold on a second. I'm in the middle of a neurochemistry fellowship, and this sounds a lot like the basic function of functional neurology, brain interaction. Like all of these, as they're talking about it, I'm like, okay, that's connected to the left brain, that's connected to the right brain. That sounds a lot like a limbic escape for somebody who's having a rage response, all of because Richard has a lot of kind of stereotypical kind of caricaturized versions of each of the types, and they also sound a lot like diagnosis or diagnoses, and those diagnoses live in particular real estates in the brain. So I keep going, it sounds a lot like just what happens in traumatic brain injury, because when you deal with a traumatic brain injury, and I was in the middle of doing another fellowship around traumatic brain injury and concussion, and I'm like, the unhealthy versions of what are being described sound a lot like what shows up when somebody has a head injury. So are there connections to how the brain works? Now, at this point, I have no history in the Enneagram. I have no lineage, no tradition, no background. I have no dog in the fight. I don't even know what this one audiobook, and I have no picture. I haven't even seen a picture of it at this point. So I go and pick up a book by Richard Riso and Russ Hudson, The Wisdom of the Enneagram. And the very first time I saw the symbol, I had this weird freaking Matrix experience. Because the Matrix, I remember sitting in the movie, watching the Matrix and saying, I'm going to go to school and do digital animation. And I'm going to learn Kung Fu. And I did. I went to school and I learned digital animation, but I didn't learn Kung Fu. But I had this Enneagram book, and I go, this looks just like the normal sketch of brain structure and brain anatomy, but it's upside down. So what happened, and why I said this Matrix experience, is I turned it upside down, took a sheet of paper, drew it, turned it upside down, and just mapped out the three triads of the brain with some of their general real estate and location and functional aspects of how they interact and what their job descriptions are, because interestingly enough, the job descriptions of each of the areas of the brain correlate exactly the same with the type descriptions of the Enneagram.
That's fascinating.
The head triad is the same thing as the left hemisphere. The heart triad is the same thing as the right hemisphere, and the gut triad is the same thing as the global brainstem.
OMG.
Not just your midbrain, which is what your arousal-based or fight-or-flight system, but your PMRF, which is the pons and the medulla, which is your rest and digest system, but also all the associated things with amygdala, with limbic, with basal ganglia, with cerebellum, like all this stuff. So you could look at it and go, my ability to think is a left brain process connected to the head triad. My ability to feel complex emotions is a right brain heart triad component, and my ability to act or react is a primitive gut-based reaction that is subconscious to every system that is underneath the cortex. So you've got your cortex, which is left and right hemisphere, and you've got your subcortex. Another really easy picture for people to see the brain and the Enneagram together is think of a broccoli stalk or a piece of broccoli. You've got the big floret on top and the stalk underneath. The stalk is your brainstem. And the broccoli on top, if you split it in the middle and you gave it two hemispheres or two sides, is your cortex. So you got this big brain and something that it sits on top of. But there's three primary parts, and those three primary parts are right brain, left brain, and brainstem, heart, head, and gut. And then I also, obviously having a background from a Judeo-Christian perspective, was like, well, this is the exact same thing as the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Son as well. Because the part of the brain that manages the body is the brainstem. It's the gut primitive response. And have I ever seen Jesus as a challenger, a peacemaker, or a reformer? Yeah. Have I ever seen the Holy Spirit as a nurturer, helper, achiever, power, creation-based, authentic, intuitive, nonverbal person, which is what the right brain does? Yeah. And have I ever seen the healthy aspect of who the Father could be as a boundary setter, clarifying, guaranteed loyalty and never forsaking, consistent in what they do, and also celebrating you by throwing a party every chance they get, but gives you a lot of language around how that works and a lot of instruction, which is what the left brain does. It's the verbal part. And I'm like, yeah, all this stuff looks to me to be exactly the same. And what ended up happening over the course of 4 hours is I put the brain on top of the Enneagram and then the Trinity on top of the Enneagram. And the last 9 years has been trying to flesh that out.
And so you just last year released your book.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's the first brain-based, neuroscience-based book on the Enneagram. Which, the way that I'm wired, it took me 8 years to make sure that I felt like I had enough of a hypothesis. That it was introduced more as a white paper, but it ended up becoming more than that. But also, it was first written as it was done as an art project for people to consume with their eyes first and their mind second, and then apply third. So we wanted to make a book that looked more like experiencing food at a Michelin star restaurant.
Yeah, I was going to say that the images are beautiful. I have it right here with me.
A woman in Atlanta named Amy Strickland, who is brilliant and far. She needs to charge more is what she needs to do. She's affordable right now, but my goal is to make her very, very expensive.
Make her very exclusive.
And also, for what it's worth, credit to Tiffany Berkowitz. I try my best to take this information and distill it, but Tiffany is the one who took the language and refined it. Because it's easy to lose the first 50 pounds, but to lose the last 10 pounds is very, very hard. And she's brilliant at that. So without Amy and Tiffany, the book would not exist.
That's beautiful. I love that the art came first. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, the primary focus is the art.
So tell me about the, I don't know what you call it, the kind of, do you call it a test or do you have another word for it?
Sure. You can call it an assessment.
Okay.
I call it a diagnostic.
Okay.
This is actually a conversation I got to have in Dallas with Suzanne Stabile in November, because we chatted about my model in comparison, because there's a lot of different traditions in the Enneagram. One of them is narrative, and then one is personality type testing. The narrative tradition is wholly opposed to a test of any kind, because they don't feel like it can identify your type properly, and I agree. And then the testing side is opposed to interview-based approaches, because they think that you can take the test and get enough information about your type, and that's enough information for you to move forward. So for instance, the Riso Hudson Enneagram Type Indicator, I think is the most comprehensive test that exists. That's pretty accurate. The challenge is some of the difficulty with the test is it's hard to answer the questions sometimes. It's also hard to eliminate confirmation bias. It's impossible to eliminate confirmation bias. It's also more behaviorally based than motivation based. So what I ended up doing is I really, really liked, and again, the story of my life is bridging two different places. A white immigrant kid from Africa who's a refugee named Jerome living in a Mohawk, Tennessee town. Okay. Patient who becomes a doctor, chiropractor who wants to also do neurology, brain guy who wants to combine the Enneagram and God. It's like all of these things are like, let's see how many things we can do. You know, have you seen the YouTube videos, Does It Blend? And they put like I feel like I'm doing that with all of these big concepts. Like, can it mix? Who knows?
I relate to that.
What ended up happening was I looked at Does It Blend? I just came up with that. I'm going to have to remember it. The thing with the narrative is it's so beautiful at doing motivational interviewing, especially if you understand trauma-informed, internal family systems, experiential dynamics, psychotherapy. Like if you understand clinical therapy, and there's not a lot of therapists doing, a lot of people who do the Enneagram are not therapists, they're not licensed professionals.
Right.
They're not licensed professionals. So I'm just throwing it out there. If anybody's listening, the Enneagram can unpack a profound amount of gifts, opportunities, healing. The challenge is you have to go through your trauma in order to do that. So if you're going to go through your trauma, it's probably a good idea to do it with somebody that's licensed and trauma informed.
Yeah, absolutely.
I second that.
I also really, really like the idea of fast tracking insights into effective and reliable data that lets me know, because this is the way the world works clinically. You have clinical intuition in your training. You have subjective information from the patient. You have objective information from the data. You put all of that stuff into a blender and you try and come up with an effective strategy to manage what the goals are of the patient or the client or the person that you're working with. And then what you're doing is you're constantly reiterating. You're taking the objective, subjective, and clinical intuition and all of the training, and then you're saying, let's see if it works, and if it doesn't, let's course correct. So you got to know how did you get here, where are you going, how do you course correct, and what's an exit strategy. Those are 4 things I do with every patient. I have to know their history effectively. I have to know where they are at the moment in terms of where they're trying to go. I have to guarantee there's going to be course corrections, because if I ask you to drive from here to Nashville or here to California, if you don't expect a course correction, you're going to die, okay? Because someone's going to change lanes into you, the weather's going to show up, you're going to get a flat tire, you're going to have to change course, even if it's only changing lanes. And then at some point you're like, I arrived, so how do I get out of the car? Or I'm not arriving, how do I exit and figure out there's got to be a different approach here? So those things are important. But what ended up happening with the methodology that I created was I didn't see a comprehensive test for being able to hold all of the numbers simultaneously, for being able to evaluate the whole identity, to being able to evaluate the whole person. All of the patients that I work with have seen providers that are way smarter than me, I promise, that are way more tenured than me, and are way more capable of taking care of that person. The difference is they're doing it in silo. They're doing it one system at a time. The reason that I get more effective results with somebody is not because I'm smarter, older, more experienced, or more tenured. It's because I'm taking a look at the entire person and seeing what the connections and the interactivity is and the interrelated nature of it is and how it intersects. And when that happens, you can start to see the domino effect that happens where someone's dealing with a profound traffic jam that's being caused because of an upstream or a downstream accident that they have never even been shown connects. So when you look at the Enneagram and go, yeah, I'm really efficient in a 2, but why am I so low in a 5? Like the Enneagram that's in the book is my Enneagram, so everybody can see how I'm functioning, okay? But I'm really efficient in 2, but 5 is my lowest number. And anybody who hears this conversation or hears the work that I do or sees the book that I wrote, if they're Enneagram driven, what are they going to tell me I am? They're not even going to ask.
5
they're going to say, you
long.
must be a 5.
Yeah.
5 is my lowest number by a freaking mile.
Oh, fascinating.
Having people understand that your highest number is profoundly important for you to be able to leverage your strengths, but your lowest number is profoundly important to actually study your shadow side, ego self, false self, trauma, deep buried spaces that don't feel safe, or even if there's no trauma related, they don't feel rewarding. So they don't feel gratifying. So you're either moving away from it because it's painful, or you're avoiding it because it's not rewarding. But either way, you're not as invested in your lower numbers as you are your high numbers. So we see concepts in the Enneagram world around knowing that you have an instinctual stack. So you have different ways of engaging from a fight, flight, or freeze response, a what they call social, sexual, and then self-preservation. Sometimes people call it one-on-one. There's different approaches. But my thought process was, if we have some degree of interaction simultaneously with our instincts, we should also have some degree of interaction simultaneously with all of the types. So the methodology was to create not only a different way of scoring the ready, but combining it with motivation-based approach and motivational interviewing-based approaches like the narrative tradition, and saying, use the test as a diagnostic, not a diagnosis. So don't make a diagnosis off of a result. Allow that objective information to inform you globally about how it's impacting your life in mental, physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual spaces. And go, what would be an effective strategy to approach each of these individual areas? Because I'm going to have to approach them completely different, because they're different systems, they're different organs, they're different spaces of function, they're different countries on the global map that is your experience. But more than anything, trying to just say, I think there is a way, if we take a deep breath and slow down from compartmentalizing all of this stuff like we're so inclined to do, stop the tribalism and the nationalism and kind of the rhetoric, and go, is there a way for me to look at this whole thing, see myself in it globally, and then start to ask better questions about what I would like to investigate or understand, especially for somebody who's low on a 5, and see where that leads us, and have a little bit more of an effective strategy for discovering, how we function and how we're wired, unique to our own lived experience.
I love that so much. What's the response to the book been like so far?
Fascinating. It has been all self-published and under self-promotion, which means that because I'm very, very allergic to self-promotion, my team that I work with knows this about me because I'm super efficient. 2 with a 3 wing is my most efficient. 5 with a 4 wing is my least efficient, which is funny because that's an innovator, and what I'm trying to do is pretty innovative, but it's also very exhausting. Because I fatigue.
You're like carrying your EpiPen around with you.
I fatigue in my lower spaces. I burn out in my higher spaces.
Yes.
You, Anna, as a therapist, a term that it can be helpful when you look at this is people are addicted to their top numbers, and they will self-medicate in their lower numbers. So it's really interesting to see.
I see it, yeah.
Especially once you start to see the self-medication for trying to avoid the lower numbers and the addiction for the fear of losing the top numbers. Really fascinating when you see the whole spectrum. But to answer your question, Katie, I was sitting yesterday with my team because we're having a conversation about relaunching the book on Amazon. With a Kindle version and an Audible version to make it more affordable and more accessible, because in 4 months we've sold 1,200 copies, and with the allergic or the allergy to self-promotion, I think we've done a total of maybe like 15 specific book-related social media posts, no email marketing, and no promotion. So it's just been word of mouth, and really, because I think what people are realizing with this content, same as what I do clinically and spiritually in a lot of places, I'm not creating a substitute for what everybody already has. I'm trying to create a supplement. So this intersects with everybody's existing language, culture, systems, approaches, and belief systems, and says, can I make it more dynamic and more effective by helping to shore up the foundational pieces? So we're almost sold out of the 3rd print run. The next print run is going to be a lot more books. We're going to put it on Amazon, launch an ebook and an Audible version, and it'll also come with a storefront, because a lot of people have been asking for the artwork. So we're going to have a storefront with all of the artwork. And so, yeah, it's been really, really kind. And I think the thing that's been the most encouraging, because my personal bias is to have a fair amount of imposter syndrome, because I just don't feel like I'm ever going to be old enough or trained enough or educated enough or experienced enough to have a seat at the table. And a 2 with a 3 wing is a steward, and a 2 with a 1 wing is a servant, and neither of those people are supposed to sit at the table. And I'm trying to change my belief around that. So when I sit with people like Russ Hudson or Suzanne Stabile or Richard Rohr, and they tell me that they're enjoying the work, I struggle to believe that. And I am also grateful that because the work has been designed to support everybody's existing spaces, there's been some confusion around the idea, but no pushback around the efficacy or the reliability. But people are trusting the credibility. They're just also digesting the perspective. And I'm hopeful that over the next 50 years, I'll be able to properly unpack it.
Yeah, speaking of tall orders, unpacking something over 50 years, full circle back to the beginning of the conversation, your job is sort of complex, unresolved cases, right? I feel like somehow that probably connects with a lot of people who are out there trying to do their own scary thing, that maybe the reason they haven't done it yet or they got stuck, in the middle or whatever is because their complex, unsolved case.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you have any advice for those people as someone whose job it is to sort of sit with and relentlessly figure out and work with complex, unresolved cases.
Yeah. What a great question. And yes, I think we can land the plane there in about 2 or 3 hours, but let's see how much we can.
Great.
Let's see how much we can get. Yeah, it's cool.
You did say expect to reroute, right?
That's right. Course correct. I think the truth of it for me, Anna, is that conceptually, when we're dealing with our own self-development and our own inner work and our own effort to even understand the complexity of who we are as people, we don't oftentimes have permission, or we weren't given permission, or we don't give ourselves permission to understand why it's so difficult. Why is it scary?
Yeah.
Well, it's scary because my brain doesn't know the difference between breaking a sweat and running from a bear. It doesn't know the difference that asking a hard question or saying out loud that I don't think that you love me is different than saying I don't feel loved in this space. Like being able to admit that you are struggling with all of these different places is profoundly difficult. But here's a concept I want you to think through. Most of us know when we're doing a workout or we're going to try and be healthier in our own body that breaking a sweat is a very normal process when you are exercising effort, when you are giving yourself the chance to work out, right? So if we take the whole metaphor of physical exercise and we apply it to mental and emotional and relational or spiritual spaces, if you realize that breaking a sweat is normal and being sore and uncomfortable is normal, it changes the whole on-ramp for the conversation. Because if I graduated high school at 315 pounds, which is true, and I was 85 pounds heavier than my twin brother, so if anybody's had body image issues and wondered what they would look like if they were 85 pounds lighter, I looked in the passenger seat every day. Okay? So I very much understand what it looks like to go, how do I navigate really, really complicated spaces? First, if I'm going to do this from a physical standpoint, and I'm going to take on the complex and profound goal of losing 100 pounds, the way that I engage that process should be similar to dealing with significant weight mentally or emotionally. And the reason that that's important is because oftentimes we're given the idea and the impression that we're supposed to resolve in a mental or an emotional trauma, or mental or emotional trauma, relational or spiritual trauma, or pain point quickly. And it's not designed to happen quickly. If I lose weight too fast, my body actually loses its current homeostasis or baseline and freaks out to put the weight back on because it happened too quickly. If you resolve something and it happened too quickly, there's one of two situations. Either the situation wasn't as severe as you initially thought, or you've underestimated the amount of time it's going to take to properly resolve it. So that being said, to come back for a second, when you say if I'm dealing with my own complex history and becoming healthy and doing that scary thing, know first and foremost that when you engage in it, it's probably going to be a good idea, if it's not some space that you are naturally familiar with or comfortable with, that a Sherpa and a partner and a counselor and a guide and a personal trainer and somebody who can support you and a team that's going to go into that gym with you and whatever that community looks like, community with a guide is a very good idea. Then when you start to do the strategy of how you're going to work out and what your goals are, how did I get here? Where am I going? What are my course corrections? How do I exit this if I achieve the goal or the goal needs to be changed? All of that stuff. Know that you're going to break a sweat. If you break a sweat, it's normal. It's going to be uncomfortable. If you're uncomfortable, you're probably going to be sore for a couple of days, because if you work out for a couple of days and you are not sore, or if you work out for even a few minutes or a couple of hours and you are not sore, the workout didn't do anything for you. The workout did not stretch you. But if you work out too hard and you injure yourself, now you've moved from discomfort to trauma. And the difference between discomfort and trauma is the length of time for recovery. Anything that you do that is only sore for a week is not a trauma. I don't care if it's mental, emotion, physical, relational, I don't care. If it hurts for less than a week, it is not a trauma. Do not reinforce it and turn it into something that you know, this is the nature of a histrionic patient a lot of times. They'll embellish something and create a situation and a mountain out of a molehill. These sayings exist for a reason, okay? Because we're all capable of doing it, because we may have perceived it as a mountain, but somebody needed us to give help us see the perspective that it was a molehill. So being uncomfortable, breaking a sweat, being sore, those are all really, really powerful indications that you're doing good work, and it will make you more healthy. But you need to be careful about moving into a space that causes injury or causes trauma that takes a long time to recover, which is where guides and communities are helpful. The other thing is, I think the short answer, and I'll distill it this way for you, I don't think there is a single thing on the planet that is more effective in becoming a healthier person than increased self-awareness. That, at the end of the day, is the panacea for literally every single thing that you could possibly encounter as a person. That why was my reaction what it was when I had a healthy response, an unhealthy response, or a blend of the two? And for me, as we develop self-awareness, it gives us the on-ramp for developing resiliency. And resiliency is how quickly can you know the difference between discomfort and trauma. Because if I know the difference between discomfort and trauma is the length of time for recovery, then immediately when I engage in something that feels profound, but I know it's just uncomfortable and it won't hurt tomorrow, but it's worth it, I immediately kick in resilience and go, I'll stay, I'll continue, I'll make another effort, I'll do another rep, I'll lift another weight. And you know, sometimes that's the case of staying in a conversation 2 or 3 minutes longer than you wanted to because it's really starting to hurt. Or you stay in the therapy session for 1 or 2 more sessions because you're like, I don't know if I can handle this. Every single person who has ever worked with a really good personal trainer has hated that trainer at a point and said they wanted to give up at a point. So if you're pushing back against your therapist or your community and saying this sucks and this is really, really hard, keep asking yourself, are they helping me to become a healthier version of myself? Is it lasting for more than a week? Can I reconcile what feels like past trauma? And definitely do the work of processing past trauma. That is so important. But I think if we realize that almost 99% of the time we engage in something that we think is going to kill us, it's just uncomfortable, the entire existence that we have in terms of a person changes because we're not effectively running from a bear that doesn't exist. Because there are no bears, generally speaking. The 3 of us are on this conversation because we are still alive. So technically, we didn't have a life-threatening experience that killed us. We may have had traumas, but the more often that I can realize that my fear is probably tied to a relevant experience, but not a life-threatening one. There are no bears.
Through some of my hardest experiences in life, one of the things that has kept me like kind of online is that idea that, you know, I'm still here, so keep going.
Yeah, and keep coming back.
If I'm still here, then I can keep going. Yeah,
and keep coming back to 3 to 5%. I mean, if I make 3 to 5% growth week over week and month over month, physically, I would consider that a good weight loss strategy. If we look at it from an investment standpoint or a job standpoint, millennials and folks in the current generations don't understand this the same way, but people who worked for a job that gave them a 3 to 5% raise every year, that was profound. If you invest in the stock market and you got 3 to 5% growth and you got compound interest, you'd be like, oh, that is a very good strategy. But when we look at investing in ourselves, we anticipate a 50 or 100% return year over year. Not only literally, but mathematically, it's not realistic. You can't win the lottery every year. Okay, and very few people win the lottery, and most people who win the lottery are bankrupt within 18 to 24 months, anyways. So you might not want to win the lottery. You might want to learn how to effectively invest in yourself, right? Rather than trying to strike it rich, So I think the key comes back into what are you investing in? And the point that I made in the book is, I think a lot of the times when people encounter therapy or a clinician or the Enneagram or whatever strategy helps them to learn about themselves, they need an answer. They need a pill. They need a turnkey. They need a make art button. And the reality is, and it says it in one of the pages in the book, this is not about giving you answers. It's about helping to ask better questions. So I think if we keep doing the work of investigating how to properly invest in ourselves or effectively invest in ourselves, and doing that in community and doing that with leadership and guides and healthy spaces, and constantly be comfortable with iteration, will build resilience and increase self-awareness. And then that'll hopefully, at the end of the day, to bring it back, give me the chance to maybe just take a single deep breath when I'm in the middle of a place where I don't have any hope.
You're teaching a lot of men to fish.
Yeah, because right now, like we talked about at the beginning, I am in a space myself where I have a guy that's sitting next to me that is going to sit with me for an hour, and we're going to try again. We're going to just see. And that is really, really hard. It's not hard to trust that this guy knows what he's doing. It's hard for me to trust that it's going to work. Because I have to try again after 20 years of having this conversation and feeling like the most disingenuous person on the planet at being able to fix people, but still struggling that all of these practices that I've gone through over the last 10 years are putting me into a place where I can say, okay, and here's the interesting thing, just to land the plane in a different point. I didn't ask him to come here. My executive assistant said, I think it would be a good idea if you schedule an appointment.
I love that.
One of the things that I've had to learn about doing scary things and kind of building hope or allowing hope to show up is giving people the space to give it to me, and being willing to receive it even if I didn't manufacture it. Because a lot of the times the way that I'm wired is it doesn't count if I didn't make it, or if I didn't try it, or I didn't produce it.
Yeah.
And part of what I've learned is I have to be willing to allow people to speak into my life and offer me the opportunity to step in and support me, because I'm very, very good at telling people no, because I don't think that they can hold it. I don't think that they can be in it. I don't want them to drown. I don't want them to be burdened by it. I certainly don't want them to die as a result of trying to save me, which is the number one person who dies in a drowning incident is a rescuer. So I have all of these dialogues going that are going to compete with whether or not I feel like I can show up. And one of the most effective things that I've found in the last 10 years at staying and being engaged is not saying no when someone offers. That's where I'm at the moment.
That's so powerful, and I appreciate you sharing so vulnerably and honestly. I think it's going to be really encouraging, hopefully hopeful to our listeners.
Everything is therapy, if you let it be.
Yes, I love it.
I appreciate the time, and thank you so much for you guys giving me the space to connect with your audience. If anybody's curious about finding out any of the convoluted, crazy things that I'm doing, the easiest way is just drjerome.com. It's just drjerome.com. That'll link to the clinic, to the book, to the neurotheology work, to whatever space you want to intersect with. And then it's also dr.jerome on Instagram, and doctor is spelled out. So doctor.jerome.
Okay, beautiful. Thanks for sharing that, because you do put out a lot of resources. So I want to make sure people get access to that. So we'll put all that in our show notes as well. But thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome.
Thanks for joining us today on the Doing Scary Things podcast. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe so you never miss one, leave a review, and share it with a friend. You can find our new album, Whisper, under the band name Jasper and Jade. Until next time.
I get a chicken, bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, chicken, bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit with grilled onions. So it's a chicken biscuit that you add bacon, cheese, grilled egg, grilled onions. Bacon, chicken, egg, and cheese biscuit with grilled onions. And every single time they're like, what?
Come on, it's Appalachian. You know that.
Oh no, that's just my face.